Hey everybody, it's the Commodore from the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and you are watching the weekly Wringer series here on clanofthegreywolf.com. Last week we had a very exciting one-year anniversary of the weekly Wringer with the live weekly Wringer as a part of the 60-hour video game marathon for charity, with the CDI being the prominent focus. And thank you again to all of those of you who tuned in and watched. Some of you were probably a little bit of a part of it, maybe chatting in the window, watching on while Rue and myself actually battled it out between Luigi and Diddy Kong. Now, as you all know, the marathons every year definitely take a little bit out of us. So this week's Wringer is going to be a little bit late in terms of posting, but that's okay. Needed a little bit of the extra time to recover, as we always do from the marathons. So anyway, so got the festive Christmas tree out. We're definitely going to do a Wringer for next week that's going to be a little more Christmas themed, so you have something like that to look forward to. But I wanted to definitely get something going for this week as well, which is why we are here. Now, I've got to wrap up the question I asked during the weekly Wringer from last week during the marathon, which was about adventure gaming. A lot of you had a lot of very interesting thoughts about adventure gaming. So many so, in fact, that I started to kind of rethink my whole position on it, which maybe not necessarily changed, but definitely was enhanced by all the many comments that you guys posted last week. So I thank you all for that. And we'll go through and highlight them as we always do. That being said, once we talk about adventure gaming, I'll give you my little spiel about it as well, as I do here on the Weekly Wringer. And then I will ask you a question next week, which should be hopefully rekindling some of the great joys you might have felt back in the Nintendo 64 era of things. So, first thing I want to do is welcome some new members to the Weekly Wringer. As we always do with the Weekly Wringer, I like to welcome new folks, but with something like the marathon, we kind of welcome in a whole new group of folks that might have been seeing the site for the first time, or even the Weekly Wringer for the first time. Some of you new folks out there might not have been tuning into the Weekly Wringer for the first time, but it is the first time you commented, and so therefore it is the time that I actually say hello to all of you. First, we have, and I'm going to try a couple ways of saying this, a Juha or a Yuha. Either way, welcome to you. Some wonderful comments this week, which I'm going to focus on in just a moment, with some of the comments that I like to highlight for last week's question. Then we have Beyond the Stars _SCR. Interesting. Beyond the Stars SCR. I haven't thought about the SCR enough, but maybe I'll think of it sometime. Anyway, in any case, awesome name. Welcome. And let's see, what else do we have? Oh, Golden Tails Geek. Welcome to you as well. Great to see all of you as a part of the Weekly Wringer community. I hope you'll be back again many times over to contribute to the next year of Weekly Wringer gaming, as much as the previous year's Weekly Wringer has been. It's been a great success. I know that there are a precious few of you that have been with me the entire time, but those of you that are jumping on, there's no prejudicing. Great to have you here, and I can't wait to see what the next week or the next year of Weekly Wringers really holds for us. All right. That being said, let's get back into the question. The question from last week was, is adventure gaming dead? Have we witnessed the death of adventure gaming? And sub-question, have we really seen the era of it come and go? Really, what was that? And I think there were a lot of really great ideas. And I want to start out with something that Ninto55 talked about, and Ninto joined us very much during the marathon, so we're very thankful. In talking about the idea of really locking down what an adventure game is. Now, as many of you did posit, I was talking about kind of the, clicking action, the click adventure games, the point and click adventure games, which tend to be more of the classic adventure gaming genre. Really what evolved from the reason that adventure games have the name that they do as a genre is because of the game adventure. which, and I say adventure like that because it is adventure with an exclamation point on the end. And so games that took from the next evolution of adventure games, which are text games, into kind of the graphical world, a la Myst and Seventh Guest, which are kind of the granddaddies of the genre. You find some really powerful adventure gaming experiences, the likes of which I think we could highlight so many wonderful examples of. But that's kind of what I was thinking of. However, it warrants, because I am vague, and many of you pointed that out, and I do that on purpose, it's good to point out what also could be construed as an adventure game. And Intel 55 talks about the idea of adventure versus action adventure. And I think if we look at the adventure game proper, what we find is the golden age of the 90s PC era, which would be exactly the point-and-click adventure that I just mentioned. Those are adventure gaming examples. That is the adventure game genre. However, as with many things, like if you said rock in music, or if you said punk, or if you said, film noir in films, right? As is with all of those, you end up with kind of generic, distinctions that aren't always very clear. But in terms of action adventure, we see something like Zelda, The Legend of Zelda, which becomes kind of an adventure game in and of itself, where you have an inventory, you have the utilization of different quests that give you items that help you progress further into the game, so on and so forth. Zelda kind of becomes a shining example of what action adventure is really all about. And every Zelda game, even the ones we played on CDI, are great examples of action adventure games. That being said, I would never consider them to be of the canon of adventure games proper, right? I think they're worthy of discussion, and I think they are worthy of the conversation of is adventure gaming dead, but I wouldn't consider those adventure games in the proper. And Rue and I have had this conversation and / argument many, many times. There's also kind of the RPG line of this, folks. So we've got things like where you have Mass Effect or something along those lines. Or even Skyrim got mentioned a few times, which were kind of the American answer to the Japanese RPG, which takes all of the kind of really interesting elements of MMOs and spins it into something that is a single-player experience that is just has a lot of RPG elements, but also has a lot of action, and a ton of action, and also a lot of adventure gaming motifs to it, which we can talk about and highlight. But in any case, it warrants mentioning that I think we have 3 different classes of video games that the lines blur in between them, but I think it's important to mention them. Adventure proper, which is what I'm really talking about. Action adventure games, which are very similar to something like a Mass Effect that takes on the kind of RPG, the Zelda, that morphs us into the Mass Effect RPG kinds of adventure games, because there are obviously lots of different kinds of RPG games. But here is what's interesting. Ninto brought up a quote that I thought was just the best quote I heard of the week, which I think really echoes my sentiments greatly, so I'm going to read it right now. Do I think adventure games are dead? No. I think adventure games are in a retirement home and rarely visited. And I think that's probably the best synopsis that I can come up with for the question from last week. I think that is a great summation of everything that I could say about about adventure games, because they are games that are really rarely kind of tackled. There are the Telltale games of the world now that do tell very wonderful stories through adventure games. You have things like L.A. Noire, and you have things like many of you mentioned, and you have games like Heavy Rain, which I think could easily be described as having adventure game, if not its soul, at its very heart. So, adventure games are not the cream of the crop anymore. They're not the big AAA titles that get developed, but they are still there, and they are visited with nods and hat tips by many of the games that you and I know, love, and enjoy these days. All right, so that's Ninto's contribution. Alberto Me talked about how the large developers no longer really develop adventure games. And to a certain extent, I agree that's really why the market facilitated a shift away from the adventure game proper. These games were relatively inexpensive to make, unless you were using full motion video like Seventh Guest and Trilobite Software was, which has enjoyed, interestingly, a resurgence of late, and I'll talk about that in my own response in a moment. But the large developers have really, in large part, kind of left. They're not really there to make adventure games anymore. Adventure games proper left for a lot of different reasons, and some of which are highlighted. Many of you mentioned some of the great reasons why, and I'll get into them. But I think that's keen insight, right? I mean, the large developers leaving the genre is what, for a large part, guys, out of sight means out of mind, right? That's just the way that it goes. So if the large developers aren't developing AAA adventure games anymore as kind of the best games that they make, then you're not going to get the kind of marketing dollars, you're not going to get the kind of experiences and development budget that gets put behind some of the games that was probably necessary to make some of the great adventure games that you and I always remember. So I think that's a good point. To go on to a Juha, or a Yuha, whatever it is, thoughts, who posted during the live weekly Ringer, but is worth mentioning here as well. Adventure games have become a little more complex and a little more nuanced, and I think they are a little bit harder to lock down. We've talked about that with kind of the blurring of the lines, as I've just mentioned, but the complexity of adventure games is definitely worth noting for one reason, and I think that's what a Juha is getting at, is that the technology has completely changed. One of the reasons that adventure gaming really becomes interesting and evolves itself is because of the technological limitations. Myst is really cool because it shows a kind of, even if it is only in still frame, a kind of graphical acuity that wasn't possible in especially the text games before it, but some of the even the stills of games that came before. I remember I had adventure games for the Commodore 64, like say, I had a game called the Keiyobashi Maru, which was a text game, text-based adventure game for Star Trek. And then there was Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk for Commodore 64, which had graphics, but was really just a text adventure game with graphics. Those had graphics, but it was nothing like something that Myst was capable of delivering, which was, many, many years away, probably 6-7 years away at that particular point in time. And so Myst shows an awesome departure to be the puzzles being at the heart of what you're trying to do. It's not just kind of collecting something and then going and killing something with that, or it enabling you to pass. A la Lost Eden, what you guys saw. Lost Eden really has kind of really borrows heavily from the old adventure games, text-based, and puts it into a much more graphically pleasing, let's say, aesthetically pleasing with graphics environment. But the Seventh Guest kind of evolves that in having these pre-rendered sequences where when you travel, you're actually traveling in the first person to the next area instead of it just being kind of a hypercard kind of stills, right? That represents a major jump. But once you get into 3D gaming and once it gets good in 3D, I think the need to have adventure games work in the same way kind of vanishes. And I think that's one of the reasons why adventure gaming proper, the point-and-click adventure, kind of died. And I think that's exactly what Juha is pointing to. And then I want to talk for a second about Chris Prangerate, who talked about, the mass market of console games. So remember, folks, there was an era when console games were not all that, right? I mean, there were console games that were kind of with children and adolescents and, very young adults kind of in mind, right? Those were what the consoles were for. And PC games were for people that had a ton of PC gaming knowledge, right? The computer clubs of the world, the evolution of the folks that are just very technologically savvy, right? So computer gaming had a much broader audience, and the broader audience was looking for games that could be a little bit more adult in nature. And I think some of the adventure games early on had those kinds of audiences at heart when they were making those kinds of games. It was